Woo! All right. I've got today. Now, originally I had planned this week, I'll tell you, for Patreon-only subscribers, thank you so much, of course, for being a Sovereign Tech patron. You really help pay the bills and make all this stuff go round and round. You have no idea. And welcome to all the new patrons. We got a lot. We're over $200 a month now. And so that puts us, we're creeping on that $500 a month to where, there can be a couple episodes of prime episodes of Sovereign Tech. And then, of course, you'd still get the Wednesday Q&A. You'd still get all of this, all this extra content. So thank you so much for that. Welcome to the new listeners, or the new patrons, I should say, of that. But I planned on releasing, because we got a lot of email for the Q&A that I did last week, not this present Q&A, which I've gotten some email about that too. People don't like hearing about post-scarcity, which ironically, the whole Q&A episode was about the fact that I had said that it's amazing how people freak out when they hear the word post-scarcity, or when they hear the term. Not that I am necessarily leaning in either direction, but whatever. Anyway, so last week we had talked about, I had the lovely and hyper-intelligent Dr. Stephanie Murphy on, and we answered a listener question about why isn't there more diversity in the libertarian/anarchist movement, whatever, why aren't there more women? Why aren't there this? And a lot of people love the episode. A lot of people recognize we really, put out our necks, and some, had questions or had further questions or further comments to make on the matter. And so I still plan on, maybe I can record it this coming Sunday, which right now it is November 11th, 2016, of course. Boy, things feel so, never mind, I'm not going there. So anyway, maybe this Sunday I'll get to record that response episode. But this week we weren't able to, just to various scheduling constraints. And woo boy, is it not exciting? Today, actually, what came out was the NES Classic. That's the Nintendo's official re-release of the original Nintendo. Of course, it only has 30 games in it, whatever. If you've listened to Sovereign Tech, you heard me talk about it, because I am so excited about this. And I'm actually, waiting to get my hands on mine through Amazon, but they have a specific time in which they're going to be selling it. So, and that's all thanks to Sex and Science Hour listeners that I'll be able to get my hands on that. So thank you so much for that as well. And of course, there'll be a Sex and Science Hour out today, and episode 199C of Sovereign Tech will be out this weekend. So anyway, I want to make sure, that Patreon listeners, you're getting your value. It's a value for value trade. You give me money, you get content. And I want to make sure you get, not just the Wednesday Q&As. I want lots of great content to get out there. And I have a lot of stuff, that's good and lined up, that maybe just needs a little work done to it and all this. But I thought I would do this fun one. This is kind of almost a bonus Q&A, because somebody asked me, they said, "Hey, Stallion, have you ever done like a top 10 lists of science fiction books and all this?" And I had mentioned on some Q&A episodes, Patreon Q&A episodes, that I would eventually record where I would go over the best science fiction books. Now, here it is. We're going to do it, and it's going to be a top 8, though honestly, it's going to be a little bit looser than that. I'm probably going to mention books that, here and there, in between all of this, that are also great books. And also, it's a top 8, but other than number 1, I wouldn't really, I can't imagine putting them in any kind of order. Like, they're all just so good, the ones that I plan on talking about. But really, number 1, and I'll save number 1 for last, that's the only one that I would actually put in order. And this was tough. This was really tough, because how do you, usually I have rules. Like when I do a top 8 movies or TV shows, movies actually is where this would be applicable. If it's part of a series, you have to have more than one movie to really understand what's going on. You can't really say it's like the best movie, because it's actually a series, right? It's actually, 5 or 6 movies or 3 movies, it's a trilogy or something like that. So I don't, generally I don't like to have that count. And it's just so hard to do that with science fiction. Or with books in general, where how do you not count the big series? You know what I mean? I mean, I could do one without it, but I don't know, then you're kind of missing out, because the greatest stuff in science fiction, and this isn't necessarily true for movies, as to where with movies, off the top of my head, I can easily think of 8 movies that blow away any film that's part of a series. That's part of a trilogy or a film series or whatever. That's just so simple. With books, especially science fiction books, that is I could think of 8 books that are great without a series, but like, you're not really bringing in the great stuff, like the greatest stuff is usually part of a series. In fact, I'll here's the hint. Number 1 most certainly is, like it's part of a series that some find questionable today. So that, but I won't spoil the surprise here. So why don't we break into it? Again, it's such a tough list to do. There's no way. In fact, with science fiction books, you could say books in general. Sure. Yeah. Like I did a top 8 nonfiction books for Sovryn proper years ago. And for some reason I felt like I did like a top 8 science fiction or a top 8 fiction, but I guess I didn't. I don't know. I don't know how I missed that. But maybe I did it for just like a climax or something, and I just didn't, when I was searching around to see what I've talked about in the past, I really couldn't find it. I don't know. I've been doing Sovryn, we're in our 4th year now. Like, it's been a while. So, you can forget. There was a while, the first 100 episodes, I could remember pretty much every episode what exactly I talked about. Like, I was really, really good at that. Specifically, the first 30 episodes, it's very easy to remember, exact details of what I had talked about. Now, honestly, there's times where I completely forget. Sometimes I just do not know what I've talked about in the past. Because we talk about so much in every single episode of Sovryn. It's near impossible to do that. But anyway, I feel like I had done this, but I think maybe what I had done is on some social media somewhere when people were, sometimes they do that. It's all right, make your list of this, and then share it. And I think I had made a list on there, and that was it. That's kind of how that shaped up. But, this is also a thing with science fiction books where it's a list that, it's kind of ever changing. Except for number 1, that's never changed for me. But I think what could fit into the top 8 changes over time. And the thing with books, too, kind of uniquely, is that books, generally, they hold up. For a lot of people, they can't watch old movies. But I don't really know many people that can't read older books, or at least books, from 100, 150 years ago up to now, whatever. I think they can hack it. Okay. They can get through it. And so they hold up a little bit better. And I'll admit, as much as I have, and maybe this is a good subject to get into or to kind of start this off before I get into the actual list. There was a time. So I grew up, I was born in 1981. So my reading career was was really at a peak in the 90s, when you're in school and all that. I remember when Shadows of the Empire came out, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Not that was a long book. I literally read it inside of 2 days. I don't know exactly how many hours it was, but I read it inside of 2 days. The number 1 book on this list, I read in a week. And that's saying something because it's a big ass fucking book. So for a lot of these things, and actually the one that we'll start off this list with too, I read in really short order. I'd read 2-3 books a week, when I was a teenager. The only way I can really do that is with audio, is if I'm doing audiobooks, which is great because audiobooks are really cool. And I've just recently gotten into audiobooks, but I only listen to fiction for audiobooks. Nonfiction, I have to read them. But for fiction with audiobooks, it works so well because one of the things that keeps you from reading faster is your inner monologue. Is the voice in your head reading it. Now there's lots of tricks that you can do to try and bypass that. But audiobooks do a great job because now that you can play audiobooks faster, you can listen to audiobooks at 2.5x or something, you can easily listen to a book far faster than I think you could read it. Or, at least certainly more than the average person could read it, right? And I know all those tricks, and I've tried them, where you just read down the center to get the gist and all that. And then there's a lot of people who say, oh, no, just read the introduction, read if they have like chapter overviews at the end of a chapter, read that, and then read the epilogue, read the last chapter or something, and then you'll read the whole book. That's how a lot of people get away with reading a book, even when they don't really read the entire thing. I don't like that. I don't do that. So anyway, I mean, I used to be, I'm still voracious, but I mean, I was fucking voracious when I was a teenager. Now, beyond that, part of the reason I was so voracious was desire. Okay, or not even just desire, it was a need that I felt. And I mean this. I felt an absolute need because at the time when I started going to, when I first started going to science fiction conventions as a teenager, which were like my life's blood. I mean, I lived for these things back then. Now, I don't know. They're too fucking commercialized. I can't deal with it. But at the time, the vanguard, not the vanguard. I should say the old guard. The old guard of science fiction was still alive, or largely still alive. I mean, Isaac Asimov had just died in, 92. Him and Frederick Pohl came out, The Angry Earth and all that. Some of these guys started dying off, but a lot of them were still around. And if anything, the fans that grew up where science fiction wasn't Star Wars, maybe not even necessarily Star Trek, but where science fiction was A.E. Van Vogt, Philip K. Dick, go down, even Alan Dean Foster, Pip and Flinks, go down the list of Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, all these guys. Okay, when that science fiction was reading those guys, Ray Bradbury and all the rest of them. That's what science fiction was. And so when you would go to these conventions, you'd have these guys, rightly or wrongly. I could see where some people would be like, well, that's kind of fucked up. Whatever. Okay. You'd go to these science fiction conventions, and if you didn't know, if you didn't read Slan from A.E. Van Vogt, if you didn't read, if you didn't read stuff from Greg Bear, or if you didn't read, the Grand Tour series from Ben Bova, if you didn't read Lucifer's Hammer, from Jerry Purnell, if you didn't read Ringworld and all this, right? If you didn't get into the Hainish cycle, if you didn't read all that stuff, you were nobody, and you weren't, no one even wanted to deal with you. All right. So there was kind of a rite of passage that I think in the 80s and 90s, you really had to go through. You had to know your shit, and there was no Cliff Notes. There was no internet to give you. And I actually, I'll admit, I get a little fucking annoyed by this. People make YouTube videos. I mean, they can make them. That's fine. I'm not saying they're wrong for making them. I'm just saying I don't like them. All right. People make these YouTube videos where it's to like designed to catch you up with, say, a certain franchise or series, or, give you an overview of the classics and all this. And not that that's necessarily anything new. I mean, like, there is Cliff Notes there, these things have existed for a while, but these are specifically designed with the intention of deception, where you are going to, you can watch this video for 15 minutes and now you can act like you know shit. Like, you can act like you know the history of science fiction, or you can act like that you've read something when you didn't, blah, blah, blah. And I hate that. Having a really great foundation in science fiction, and I firmly believe that science fiction is the singular most important literary form on the planet. They are the most important books out there for so many reasons. I mean, if you want to quote Einstein and say, imagination is more important than knowledge, meaning that imagination is the core of the application of anything any information that you take in, thus knowledge. That's kind of the meaning of that phrase. And that's how you come up with new ideas, and all this is through imagination and everything. Science fiction has unquestionably forwarded humanity. If anything, maybe not the quality of life perhaps, but the standard of living has certainly significantly increased. And a lot of that comes from a lot of boyhood dreams of wanting to make science fiction a reality. It's important. It is, when I was growing up, it was the bastard stepson of literary fiction. Okay. As to where now it's like, oh, everybody's fucking on it. You know what I mean? Everybody's into it. That wasn't always true. I mean, there was a time Well, I mean, that's the thing. A lot of people say this. I don't want to make this about me. I really don't. But a lot of people are like, Brian, where does all the passion come from? Where does a lot of the, maybe even some of the anger come from? Where does all this different stuff come from? Well, here's the thing. So I grew up in a very unique time. I mean, you could say any time's unique. Fine. Okay. But the 80s and 90s were a very unique time because they were the pinnacle of consumerism and a lot of other things, and not necessarily all bad. In fact, a lot of it quite good. I mean, the pinnacle of economies. I mean, it was really just I mean this. It was a magical fucking time. Even pre-internet, it was fucking amazing. What was going on at the time and what was available at the time and all this. But at the same time, when all of this great shit's available, right? And all this great shit's going on, a lot of it you get chastised and bullied and made fun of for, when you're a kid. Like being into science fiction, that was, you're a nerd, you're a geek, you're a dork, get out of here, you're a loser. I mean, like that's the thing. Now everybody's like, oh yeah, I watched The Big Bang Theory, ha 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 ha, even though I hate that show because I think that it's not laughing with nerddom. It is actually insulting nerds. It is laughing at nerds. Okay, it's not laughing with. It's just a terrible. It's a travesty, honestly, on television. But if you were into Doctor Who in the 90s, I mean, now if you're into Doctor Who, oh fucking everybody's into Doctor Who, right? In the 90s, oh no. In the late 80s, like you like Sylvester McCoy, you fucking loser, and you honestly you could probably get tripped up or someone slam your books out of your hands and all this stuff. And also, at the time, Star Wars, everybody loves Star Wars now, right? Guess what? There was a time where not everybody loved Star Wars. Not because everybody didn't recognize that Star Wars was genuinely great, like the original trilogy and all that, but because there wasn't any more Star Wars. It's what's called the Dark Times. Okay, where before the Timothy Zahn trilogy and all that, like there was very little to none Star Wars, and so since there wasn't anything new getting made, nobody cared about it because that's how people work. If it's not in front of their fucking face, 24/7, they have no brain, or well, they have no memory anyway, and it just kind of goes away, and so they don't think about it. So if you're still into Star Wars, their concept of what Star Wars was at the time was, well, that's old. There's nothing new about this. That's old. What the fuck? Or even like Star Trek. Now, today, everybody's dying for a new Star Trek movie, right? Yeah, give us another Star Trek movie. Give us another Star Trek movie. Back then, in the 90s, literally you had commercials that made fun of the fact that there were so many Star Trek movies. Today, that'd be insane. Who the hell would agree with that? Now you have entire series of films, Harry Potter and whatever else. And like, nobody has that attitude of, oh no, not another fucking Harry Potter movie. Nobody talks that way today. But back then that was very common because there was the idea that, well, if it's not in your face and if it's not, here every second and something new isn't get made, it's old and it sucks. And that attitude still kind of exists today in some ways. But my point being is that, you really, if you were a science fiction or fantasy fan in that time, in the 80s and 90s, and especially if you were very young, if you were a young person, you got forged. You went through some pretty serious shit, to where you're getting picked on to no end. And then you had kind of the old guard of science fiction fans who they had, they kind of set up a little priesthood. And I think this is okay. I really don't have a problem with it. But they kind of set up their own little quasi priesthood where you need to know your shit or you don't get to hang, you don't get to be around. I mean, a lot of it all comes down to you got to be cool, blah, blah, blah. And there's issues with all of that. But I kind of agree with the idea that, no, I want a basis of, I want a common ground to be able to interact with people. Where, like one of the most popular things to do back then was to quote things nonstop. That seems to have kind of gone by the wayside. I mean, which is ironic because people are sharing quotes all the time, but not a lot of people are like talking in quotes. Like my friends and I, of varying ages, we would talk, we would have almost contests, and they were spontaneous. It wasn't something that we agreed upon. They were just like these spontaneous contests of how much can we quote in, can we have an entire conversation in quotes, blah, blah, blah. Everything was a fucking quote, be it movies, books, whatever. And if you want to see, speaking of pinnacles, if you want to see the pinnacle of what a lot of this looks like, I think I mentioned it. I did the ranking for Patreon of all of the Star Trek movies. I ranked every one. And in that, I talked about the movie Free Enterprise. Now, that has nothing to do with free markets. And, it's a romantic comedy of sorts about a couple of science fiction fans. It was made in the late 90s, and it is the epitome of what at the time, being a science fiction fan looked like, and what you needed to be, and they do it throughout the movie too. I love the movie; it's one of my favorite movies. Okay, but they do it throughout the movie where they're constantly quoting. They're going to TRU, which is what we used to call Toys R Us. Okay, they're going to TRU, and they'd say, "All right, stay on target," because they're quoting the end of A New Hope, right, of Star Wars, where they're doing the trench run against Death Star, and they'd say a bunch of different shit, they'd sing "Stepping into Eden, yeah, brother," which that's from the original series of Star Trek. That's an episode of The Way to Eat. So anyway, that was a thing, and a lot of that sort of seems to have fallen by the wayside. And part of that reason being is likely it has to do with the fact, and I'm 20 minutes in, and I even started going down the list, but likely it has to do with the fact, the reason people like the whole quote thing and a lot of that stuff doesn't exist anymore is because there's so much shit. There's so much shit. Like, people don't get it in the 90s. Like when Babylon 5 was on in the 90s, that was one of a very few shows that were science fiction that were on television. There was almost none. Now it's fucking all over the place. I mean, there's tons of it. But, at that time, you had Babylon 5. You had some other, you had Space Precinct. You had some odd shows here and there. But largely, there weren't a lot of big science fiction shows. What was it? Super Force. You had a few of those. There's a lot of cartoons that were science fiction-y. And I think that's why cartoons are looked upon so fondly by people, I guess I'll say, of my generation and maybe a little older, because that was one of the only real ways you could get far out science fiction, especially since you didn't have gigantic special effects budgets at the time. And even movies, there weren't that many movies at the time either. Like Stargate was such an oddball, back in, what was that, 94 or 96? Well, yeah, anyway, that was not, yeah, it was 94. That was an oddball. To be so successful and be science fiction at the time. So, all of that said, I got asked, just to understand where we're kind of coming from here. Okay, I got asked, what are the greatest science fiction books of all time? Now, I'll tell you, every single one of them are either from the 90s and back. That's not because today there aren't great science fiction books getting written, Ernest Cline's coming out with great stuff. There's a lot of, A.G. Riddle. There's a lot of great authors out there coming out with modern science fiction that's really solid stuff. It's great shit, okay? But frankly, there's a reason some of these things have just lasted forever. Like that people still talk about the Foundation trilogy, that people still talk about Lord of the Rings, right? Even though it's fantasy. That people talk about all these different, books because they're so foundational. They stand the test of time so well that honestly, there's nothing really new that I think hits that level. That some of these books that I'm going to go over, really did. And if anything, this will also help you some of it anyway, give you that foundation that I was talking about. Not Isaac Asimov's foundation, but give you that foundation of, okay, when the old guard were still alive and were still rocking the convention scene and it wasn't taken over by a bunch of cosplayers. This is the stuff that they kind of expected you to read. Some of it, anyway. Some of this, a couple of this is really kind of personal taste. But yeah, why don't we break into it? So this should be fun. And I wouldn't hold this up to anybody. It's like, oh, if you didn't read this shit, I'm not one of those guys. I mean, yes, I do judge people based on what they have and haven't read, but I get it why people may not have read this stuff. And I mean, and there's such a deluge of books today. I mean, I don't blame people for not having gone back, but I really think there's a lot of value in that. So why don't we start it off? Let's start going down this list here. And I'm going to start it off with a book that, ironically, I didn't read, only because what I knew of the author was so fucked up that I was like, no, I'm not going to read any of his shit. And until it was going to be until it got re-released because they were going to be releasing a movie with John Travolta in it. You might know what I'm already talking about now. I didn't read it. And then me and my buddy Spock, his name's Ryan. Actually, I met him when I was 15, and we hit it off just like that in high school. And, we had been best friends for 15 years after that. And we always went to, we go to Barnes and Noble and everything. And we'd hang out in the science fiction section just all the fucking time. And so, we saw this book. It's like, oh, they're going to make this into a movie. And oh shit, Travolta's going to be in it. All right, cool. Welcome back, Kotter. Let's do it. And, we bought it and we read it because it was this huge book. And that was the real attraction to this book, is that, and I think it still is. I think it's still the largest science fiction book ever written. It's bigger than the Bible. It is 1,000+ pages. It is massive. And it is great. And it is, even though the movie wasn't. The movie was horrifying. And the book is Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard. Yes, L. Ron Hubbard. Scientology. The book originally came out in 1982. Again, I didn't read it until, I guess this would have been 1997 or 98, maybe when they did that re-release because I think the movie came out in 99. Or maybe the movie came out in, the movie came out in 2000. So it would have been 98, 99, something like that I would have that I would have read this book. And again, it is gigantic. I mean, it is just a massive fucking book. And it chronicles the story of Johnny Goodboy Tyler. Yes, that's the name of the main character. This is kind of space opera, and people, I'm not going to play too particular with genres in what I'm going to list off here. But this definitely plays off as space opera. And it has to do with, it's in the year 3000, literally, it's in the year 3000, and this alien species called the Cyclos within the story, they're kind of led by this character named Turl, who kidnaps, Johnny Goodboy Tyler, and things go on from there. But it's a post-apocalyptic story. In fact, Johnny Goodboy Tyler, he experiences the Cyclos because he wants to live. He's living in the Colorado mountains, near Denver, and he hears these stories about these monsters. But all of the people and I'm not really giving anything away, at least not within the first couple chapters. He leaves his village where he lives because everybody there is just getting sick, and they're getting sick from uranium sickness. Okay, it has to do with some degree of nuclear, the nukes in the area and all this. And so he goes down into Denver, finds the ruins of Denver, and then, of course, Turl, the Cyclo, finds him and kind of turns him into a bit of a pet and kind of a pet project. And it's this amazing, overall, the story, and I'll try not, this is going to be the other hard part of this, is what are spoilers? If I might stumble on them, not that I really care about spoilers, and most of these books, all of these books are so old, really, folks, if you haven't read them. I shouldn't say that, because reading books is not as easy as watching a movie. But for fuck's sake, okay, give me a break. Anyway, so the whole book, and again, it is gigantic. And this spans, it really could have been an entire book series. And maybe originally it was supposed to be kind of like L. Ron Hubbard's Mission Earth series, which isn't half as good. But it spans an incredible amount of time. And it is all about, kind of this human revolt against the Cyclos, and it ends, they take it all the way. They get their asses off Earth, and then it goes from there. Because, the Cyclos have these learning machines, and Johnny ends up getting hooked up to one and becomes brilliant, and he leads all these things. Do not, by all means, if you ever saw the movie, do not judge this book by that movie. In fact, I feel bad because, and I think I've told this story before, but I said that when I knew a movie was coming out, and after I read the book and I knew how great the fucking book was, I said, even if the movie, I said, there's a chance the movie could be bad. Right? Like, I mean, that's what everybody says, well, what if, yeah, the book's great, but what if the movie sucks ass? I was like, well, even if, and there's no reason that it can't be, even if it's just a 10th of the book, if it just covers a 10th of the book with accuracy, there's no way that this movie isn't going to be anything less than great. And I was dead wrong. In fact, I remember reading in the newspaper, newspapers are a thing, like the reviews, and it said, Battlefield Earth bombs. Like that was that was the headline for it. It was so bad. And the movie really it was terrible. They totally screwed things up. John Travolta, who was actually on a pretty good run at the time, couldn't save it for the life of him, and they fucked everything up. The audiobook version that you can get on Audible is also very good. So you can jump on that if you want to. And maybe you want to, because like I said, long ass book, but it's great. I mean, and it gets into and it's very sexy, and I don't, there's nothing in there. Like I've read Dianetics, because in the 90s, there was kind of a big push. There was there was a big push for Scientology. Like they run ads and everything, like scientific fact and, all this crap. I've read all those books, and none of that I really felt like was in Battlefield Earth. So don't worry, you're not getting a Scientology speech when you read this book whatsoever. So, but it's a book. It's a lot of fun, lots of twists and turns, very clever hooks, and like I said, it's kind of sexy because these people are quasi-primitive, but then, they're going, they're interacting with a lot of, high-end technology. It kind of almost feels like the Herculoids with all the wild creatures, without Glebe and Gloop, doing their thing. So I love it. I think it's definitely one of the best science fiction books ever made, especially as a standalone, even though, again, it's so long, it could have been a series. Just lots and lots of fun, and I mean, tremendous action. And you feel it. Like, L. Ron Hubbard obviously was a great fucking writer. And I stand by, Harlan Ellison said this, okay? I remember him saying this to me. I stand by the fact, and he said it in a million other places too, that he said he was in the room, this would be like back in the 50s or whatever, where L. Ron Hubbard was just so flustered, he got up, he threw down whatever he had in his hand, and he said, screw this, I'm going to go start a religion. That's where the money is. Because he was originally a science fiction author, right? And Harlan Ellison, who's one of the greatest speculative fiction, he wouldn't want me to call him a science fiction author, but whatever. One of the greatest authors, just straight up, of all time. He would tell you that he thinks that he knows that L. Ron Hubbard made it all up. And he admitted that he made it all up, effectively. There you have it. There it is with Scientology. But that doesn't mean that L. Ron Hubbard wasn't a great author. I mean, the Mission Earth series is pretty good. It's not as good as Battlefield Earth, and they're not really related. But yeah, Battlefield Earth is just phenomenal. So anyway, let's move on to another book in the series. Now, here's where this will be kind of the first one. Not that I'm going to get into a bunch of these at all, but this is... I don't know that it could be said that it's the original anarchist work of science fiction. I don't know that it can make that claim because there could have been something else. But for a lot of people, this is like the first time, actually just for a lot of people, just people in general, this is the first time they ever experienced anarchism. And, reality or not reality, because obviously this is fiction. And it's The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, she is just one of the greatest of all time, obviously. It was originally released in 1974. And it is part of, technically, even though Ursula would tell you differently, she would say this is not part of a series. Everybody else kind of puts it together in a series. And the series is called The Hainish Cycle. You have Left Hand of Darkness is a part of that, and some of her other books where they're all kind of interconnected. And I read these as being part of a series. Like I read all of those books, and they're all great. Left Hand of Darkness is phenomenal. The Dispossessed is really good. And yeah, so it's up to you if you want to do that. Now, if you do want to read the entire Hainish Cycle, This, ironically, even though The Dispossessed was not the first book in what is considered the larger Hainish cycle, it is chronologically the first. Like what the events in the story are the first to happen. And probably that has to do with the main character in The Dispossessed is Dr. Shevek. And Dr. Shevek, he's coming up with what, amounts to warp drive, okay, within this book's universe. And so that's what allows, arguably, for what happens in a lot of other Ursula K. Le Guin's books. That's why this is chronologically considered the first one of the Hainish cycle. But this is, it's a phenomenal book. It might come off as like not that. I think at the time, back in the 70s, this was revolutionary in a million ways. One being, you never really read about anarchism in fiction, I don't think, and certainly not in popular fiction. Also, a lot of the sexuality within the book is very risque for its time, because again, we're talking about a time frame around when like Dangerous Visions came out, which a lot of people read Dangerous Visions now, which, the aforementioned Harlan Ellison was the editor of. This is considered like the penultimate, or not, it is the ultimate, penultimate means second ultimate. It is the ultimate, science fiction or speculative fiction anthology of all time, that being Dangerous Visions, and it could easily make this list. It didn't, but it could easily do so. But anyway, a lot of that stuff you read today, you would probably consider pretty tame, especially in light of, say, 50 Shades of Grey, shit like this that has been out for a while. But at the time, it was pretty far out. There's homosexuality, there's all kinds of things within this. So it's the story, The Dispossessed is really the story of two worlds. There's Inaris and Uras, and they are, one is kind of a moon of the other, or maybe it's like more like a double planetary system. But anyway, Inaris is effectively the moon to Uras, which neither of the, Uras isn't Earth. Earth is actually in The Dispossessed. Earth is like old Earth. Like they know that planet's out there. But the idea is behind the larger Hainish cycle, which The Dispossessed doesn't get into too much as far as describing, is that humanity actually started on another planet. It didn't start on Earth. Earth forgot that humans came from somewhere else, which is an interesting concept in itself and is fun to read when you read the larger Hainish cycle, of books. But The Dispossessed gets into some really wild stuff. Now, there is on Uras, on the planet Uras, which is where most of the book takes place, you have it's just like Earth in the sense that there's countries, there's a bunch of different political types of systems, blah, blah, there's socialism, capitalism, all this different shit. As to where on Inaris, which is where the lead character, Dr. Shevek, is from, on Inaris, it is anarchist. Now, it is more of a communist anarchism. And it's by the Adonians, who followed this revolutionary from Uras, like 100 some odd years prior, named Odo, nothing to do with the guy from Star Trek, from Deep Space Nine, the shapeshifter. But anyway, so Inaris it's interesting to read about, because here is a system laid out of anarchism, and even within it, there's the constant talk on Uras about the fact that, look, Inaris is so important because it proved that anarchism could actually exist and thrive. Not even though it's communist, and Inaris is like this wasteland, effectively, and you can't really grow much there, blah blah blah. It's not Ancapistan, as some would call that. It's not the libertarian paradise, at least not resources wise. It really does a great job of, because it's playing off Inaris versus all the different political types on Uras, and so there's really how to put this? There's an exploration of these ideas. And I think a lot of people, I'll tell you, not giving away much in the story, all kinds of different events happens, with Dr. Shevek, and he gets to give some very interesting speeches. And there's some really genuinely great ideas in it, like that you don't own people, which, shouldn't be far out in science fiction. But ironically, The Dispossessed is a rare case where that is made explicit. Where was I going to go with that? So on Anaris, like the anarchism being described that exists on Anaris, like it's a book, you know, The Dispossessed, the book, is also critical of the anarchism that gets put on display. Like, there are problems on Anaris. It is not perfect, you know, which is okay because anarchism in itself, and there's a problem with this, and I've talked about this in recent Q&A episodes, where when people sell anarchism, they are trying to sell a utopia, when that's really not what it's about. It's about what's ethical. You know, it's about what is, you know, what do you have the right to do? What don't you? Blah, blah, blah. You know, it's not about safety. It's not about security. It's not about, you know, it's not about offering people paradise. Anarchism is just what is right and wrong when it concerns the individual and the treatment of individuals. So The Dispossessed, you know, a lot of people, I think, look at it and they want to build a society based on, and I've met these people, believe me, at conventions and elsewhere. Okay, where they want to build a society like Ursula K. Le Guin laid out on Anaris in The Dispossessed. Thing is, you know, they're a little overzealous because Ursula K. Le Guin, you know, knocks Anaris itself, you know, in various points in it. Granted, I think it could easily be said that Anaris is being shown off as the superior social system, but it's not perfect. You know, like there's problems, and there's problems with the way things are really set up. At least that's my interpretation. That's how I read it, and obviously I certainly have a lot of problems with how things get laid out in that. But it's worth reading. It's worth reading that exploration of, you know, of anarchism. Again, it's more of a communist anarchism, but still broaden your fucking horizons, get out of your filter bubble, okay, and learn about this stuff and read about it. And you know, what does this look like? Because there's some great concepts laid out in what Ursula K. Le Guin does in, you know, her little ideological treatise known as The Dispossessed. So I think this is just a very essential book. I know it's kind of sad because I know a lot of people, a lot of libertarians, a lot of, anarchists of the capitalist persuasion. They're really big on like Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is a great book. I'm not taking anything away from that. Okay. And there is real libertarian fiction out there that's big on the free market and all that stuff. Right. And that's fine. But like, I think a lot of them ignore The Dispossessed, which is a pity because The Dispossessed really like explores these ideas as to where instead I think Heinlein a lot of times doesn't necessarily explore them, but he just kind of like lays them out. Like, no, this is how it is. This is how it could be. And so people get excited about that. And I understand that. I love, I like a lot of his books, even though I disagree with some of his philosophical points. A book that could easily have made this list is Stranger in a Strange Land. I think it's phenomenal. What it has to say about love, there's not another book like it. I don't think. Not really. It's a beautiful read in that sense. Moon is a Harsh Mistress is pretty good too. There's lots of Heinlein works, that's really great. But don't ignore The Dispossessed because and the Hainish Cycle in general. I mean, The Left Hand of Darkness, a lot of people would say is a greater book. I wouldn't argue against that point if you want to make that claim. And the other books in the series, it's all very good. Read everything by Ursula K. Le Guin for fuck's sake. But I think The Dispossessed is one of those things that's required reading. And I think it's genuinely great. I think some of the quotes from it are absolutely phenomenal. I think some of the explorations of the human condition are positively unique and have never been replicated in science fiction. So just great stuff. And I kind of want to give something away, but at the same time, I don't. But let's just say it's that rare book also that doesn't have to have like a really fucked up or like depressing ending or anything necessarily along those lines. It's good. So anyway, let's move on to another book. And now, why don't we go way back? I think any top list of like science fiction books would really be remiss without mentioning one of these two authors and one of their books. The two authors would be either H.G. Wells or the one that I'm going to mention, which is Jules Verne. Now, you could also say you can't talk science fiction without talking Mary Shelley, who is in many ways considered the first science fiction author, with Frankenstein. I'm on board with you, baby. Okay, I get that. But, not everybody really thinks of Frankenstein as a science fiction book, even though it's exactly what it is. Just like a lot of people don't think of Atlas Shrugged as a science fiction book, when Ayn Rand absolutely 100% wrote a science fiction book, and it's a damn good one, in my opinion. So anyway, I am going to go into Jules Verne, and I want to talk about this book because actually this plays off nicely off of The Dispossessed, because I think this is really also an anarchist work of fiction, which is interesting that science fiction in many ways is really the only genre that will even take on that ideology for a second, which may explain why a lot of anarchists also happen to be, science fiction fans. Not all of them are, but a lot of them are. And of course, I don't know that I need to tell you the story of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and that is the book that I am recommending here. But so much of what you read in that, obviously it's all about Captain Nemo and, that whole shtick, that whole voyage under the, it's not Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, but, that whole underwater voyage. It is a commentary, I think, in a lot of ways, about how, Nemo is just so tired of the bullshit that goes on in normal man's world, or that might not have been his exact terms that he would have used, but, above water. And he's really tired of it. And so he builds for himself, the submarine, and that alone, this kind of like the idea of independently powered submarine and all that was really amazing for Jules Verne to come up with. But he even says, in the sea, there's no laws. There's so many things within this that are equally, as much as like The Dispossessed, where it's very much a commentary on society, even in 1870, when 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was originally published. None of the movies do this any justice. They don't even really come close. Perhaps the best representation, in my opinion, of Captain Nemo was in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the movie. And the comic book series. The comic book series is great, and I actually enjoy the movie. Fuck everybody else. I really liked League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. So there's a very particular version, though, of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that I recommend people get, and you're not going to get it digitally. Some of these books that I'm going to mention, there aren't digital copies of. I've got my little stack of dead trees next to me here to cover some of them because they haven't been turned into that. Now, I do plan on taking some of my copies and sending them off to a service to where they can get scanned digitally, and then I want to make them available for everybody. But this is one where I really do recommend getting your hands on this. And ironically, for a book that comes off as, in my opinion, very, very anarchist, this edition was actually published in 1993 by the United States Naval Institute. And it's a translation by Walter James Miller and Frederick Paul Walter. It is a massive tome, this version, because it's an annotated edition, and also it is based off of a more complete manuscript of Jules Verne's work. So even if you've already read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, if you didn't read the edition from the U.S. Naval Institute, you're getting an incomplete book. And there's so many more little lines said and little events that happen within the restored version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that I really recommend reading it. And again, it's a great little voyage. It's interesting to read that 19th century writing. And it's you read it and you really get the sense, boy, this book is ahead of its time. It's way ahead of its time. And I think for science fiction itself, just as a commentary on the genre, it speaks well, because while at times science fiction is terrible at predicting the future, other times it's a little too good. It's a little creepy at how good it is, at doing that. Of course, Jules Verne is the very well-known, French writer, and Jules Verne, had done other works as well. Not just, in fact, there's a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, nowhere near as good, and there's some contradictions between the two. So that's why I kind of recommend, go with 20,000 Leagues and make sure you get the restored version. But he has other books that are particularly interesting. In fact, there's one that he originally wrote before 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but that didn't get published. So originally it was written in 1863. But I don't think it didn't get published until the 90s. Like maybe like 1994, it finally got published, which is interesting. There was, I mean, obviously there was kind of a, I don't know, there's a bit of an anniversary going on in the early 90s for Jules Verne, so, you know, that's why some of the stuff was coming out. But this other book is called Paris in the 20th Century. And it all takes place, the whole book takes place in August of 1960. And it is, you know, you read it, it's not like, I mean, it's not like there's a great, a great plot happening in it, not like in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where there's a lot of intrigue and all that. But what's really interesting about Paris in the 20th century is just how good a job Jules Verne did of predicting the year 1960. There's all kinds of, again, it was written 100 years previous to that. 100 years before 1960 it was written. And, I mean, everything, like there's cars in it, what they call them gas cabs, but not just cars, but like also gas stations. Like it'd be one thing, oh yeah, he just wrote about cars, but no, like Jules wrote about, the infrastructure as well. You know, he wrote about gas stations, what that, kind of what that would look like. There's things that equate to effectively to fax machines, which in the 90s when this got published, fax machines were all the rage, right? When this finally got published, 130 some odd years later. I mean, there's the idea of like a Japanese bullet train, using magnetism, compressed air, the high-speed train, that's in there. Street lamps, electric lights. There's these really wild devices that pretty much shape up to primitive computers that are interconnected in a network, and you can send messages with them. And these are electronic devices. I mean, it is really fucking something to read, Paris in the 20th century, because just how much Jules Verne really got right. And I'm just scratching the surface of what exactly was talked about in that book. Holy shit. So reading Jules Verne is quintessential in my opinion, when you're talking about great science fiction. But 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea definitely stands pretty tall in all of that because of just how futuristic it is while taking place in the far past, or not in the far past, but in the past, taking place in the 19th century. I relate a lot to the character of Nemo. I have to say, and I did as a teenager too. When I first read it, it was just so. I don't know. You kind of feel it if you're the brooding type, right? Like you can definitely understand where Nemo's coming from in a lot of things, even though he's kind of a violent character. At times, I don't buy into that anymore, but. Anyway, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Make sure you get that United States Naval Institute. You can get it used. That way you're not giving them any more money. but it's just a tremendous read. So anyway, let's move on to another book. And this is where I'm going to start off getting into a book series. And while we're going through the whole anarchist thing, we'd be remiss if we didn't bring this up. And that is the Culture series by Ian M. Banks. And Ian M. Banks, of course, Scottish author. He passed away a few years ago. The Culture series comprises quite a few books, 10 books total, pretty much. The first book came out in '87, and the last one I think finally came out in 2012. You got a lot to read here in the series, and it's the first one. Consider Phlebas. Get through that. Like, I think that's a great book, but you got to get through that and get to the rest of the Culture series to really soak it up. But this is definitely, an anarchist utopia that gets laid out where it deals with a humanity far, far in the future that has reached a post-scarcity economy. And AI, they've developed artificial, AGI, artificial general intelligence, and pretty much the AI takes care of everything. And the humans, they're not really treated as pets. In fact, they're treated with great respect. The AIs are often like amazed and amused at the leaps in logic that humans can achieve that they would have never even considered. In some ways, they almost want to, why don't the AIs just wipe out the humans? Well, in some ways, the humans, they recognize the humans are superior in some ways to themselves. but it's varying degrees. And it deals with, how does the culture, as it's called, which they go around on these giant spaceships and all this different stuff. Again, it's a post-scarcity, culture. But it's the culture, interacting with lesser developed worlds and all this. That's sort of where the conflict comes in. And it's a wild read. I mean, to talk about, again, it gets into that exploration of ideologies. It gets into the exploration of a lot of different things, even like the interaction between AI and humans, even though lately I'm more of the opinion that maybe AI is never really going to be a thing. But automation, it could still speak to that, and that's certainly something that's coming up. And the best one, I think the best in the series for me is probably maybe Accession. I think it's Accession, where you find out like that not everything is so hunky-dory in the culture, and that the culture actually kind of fucks up. Like they sort of walk away not being on the moral high ground for once. So that's I think it's Succession where that book happens in that. It's kind of tough to remember everything or which book, what happens in which book. But just a phenomenal 10 novel series that I think every science fiction fan should read, not just anarchists. Interestingly, Mark Zuckerberg, I think it was last year, he said the first book in the Culture series that he had read it and it was really eye-opening for him. I mean, granted, it's post-scarcity, there isn't really money and all this. It's complicated. So you could say it's looking at a more socialist direction, but it's still just fascinating. And there's still plenty of things within it that, that reek of capitalism, I think. So a totally worthy read, especially just because it's so rare to find, especially a very popular book series, because, we're talking 10 books in, to find a book series that is unapologetically anarchist. And I kind of feel like, I'll tell you, this goes true for a lot of this. The reason, so now, Ursula, The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, it's amazing that that's never really been turned into a movie or a TV series or anything like that. I know it's been optioned around here and there to do it, but it'll probably never get made because of the very thing which is ironic, because The Dispossessed says it within itself, that, look, here's proof that anarchism could work. Not that book is proof, but you get my point. People, it seems like the establishment, whatever that happens to be, they, them, those, really don't like the idea of you seeing a positive light on anarchism. Like, that's just not allowed. And so I think the Culture series will probably never get made into movies because of that, even though they are wildly successful books. And that's why people don't talk about them either, even other science fiction authors and science fiction critics, because they don't want to talk about anarchism. The Dispossessed being, kind of I guess maybe because it's more of a what some would say would be a liberal bent, perhaps. That's why, they don't mind talking about that one, but then you're still never going to see a movie. Even though they keep saying they're going to come out with one, it's probably never going to see the light of day. Now, I said 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was an anarchist book too, and I think it really is. How did that make it as movies? Well, folks, like I said, don't bother watching any of the movies. None of them live up to what Captain Nemo says. Like, some of his most important lines, you've never, ever fucking heard them. Whether you saw that ABC miniseries that came out, what was that, in the late 90s or something, no matter where you saw it, it didn't happen. You never got the real gist, the real messages of what Jules Verne was putting in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So, maybe they'll bastardize these things and eventually turn them into movies. But with the Culture series, I don't think you can do it. Like, I don't think you can remove the anarchism from that enough to where you can make a movie about it. And I've even heard that that's been optioned around to make a movie. I don't see it ever happening. So, but do read the Culture series. Anyway, let's get on to our next one. So this is one of those areas where things got tough. Personally, and this is just my opinion, I think if anybody's given you a list of the greatest science fiction books ever written, if they don't have an Isaac Asimov book on there, they're liars, and they're full of shit. I don't know how else to say it. And this is where it gets tough, because, like, would I want to put the entire, like the Grand Robot Empire Foundation series as held that up as, look, you got to read the whole thing. Well, I mean, first off, it's like 30 some, I mean, it's just a ridiculous amount of books and short stories. I don't expect anybody to be able to get through that. And then there's even the second Foundation books, which was like another trilogy that was done by what was called Friends of the Foundation, by like Greg Bear and even I think David Brin did one. And some others where they did, like, they had the furthering adventures of the Second Foundation and even the Secret Foundation. Ooh. I love that whole series. I love the Robots books. I love the Empire books, the Galactic Empire books. I love the Foundation series. All that's great, and I would recommend them to you, with no reservation. If that's the only science fiction you ever read all that, because it's all fucking great. Even though Asimov never really took that turn to anarchism, I don't think. And not that something has to be anarchist to be great science fiction. I'm not making that claim. I do like to highlight it, and I like knowing that it's out there. And when it's also a great book, like The Dispossessed, oh, fucking, well, awesome. Okay. So I'm not going to, the Foundation books should just automatically be at the top anyway. If there's a book 0, that would be the book 0. But what I'm going to mention to you is actually my favorite Asimov book outside of that grand series, because again, iRobot's part of the Foundation series technically. Caves of Steel, all that, they're all part of it now. It's all one gigantic big fucking series. But he has a few books that stand outside of it. Nemesis, for one, is a great book. I love Nemesis because he made the case, even though now it's considered almost scientific fact that this is possible, even though 5 years ago it was not. It was it was considered total bullshit. Nemesis makes this case that there is another planetoid that swings through our solar system and has like kind of its own star and all this. I mean, like it's a really far out book, and it's about that planet finally coming back, and that planet has humans on it. It kind of reads like a Sitchin piece of work, So I really love Nemesis. I think that's great, but that's not the book. The book I'm going to recommend, and I know I've talked about this on Sovereign Tech before, but it's The Gods Themselves. Now, it's very difficult to even describe the plot, okay, for this book. Here's how I'm going to describe it to you, though. There are a couple books in my life that I have read. One of them is supposedly nonfiction, though obviously I think it's fiction. There's a couple books that I've read where I say to myself, yeah, I don't, if somebody told me a human didn't write that, I'd believe him. And The Gods Themselves is one of those books where Asimov does the incredible and answers, really, in my opinion, he answers a problem in science fiction to where science fiction is all about, alien, or not, it's not all about. A lot of times, and what a lot of people look for, it's about aliens, it's about, far off galaxies and, or whatever, all that different shit, right? But it's always written from a human bias, I guess you could say. Not that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, you want that because you want to be able to relate. But then also, it's fun when there's something that, no, there's nothing human about this. We are reading alien works, right? And who wouldn't want to read a book, translated into English, say, that was originally written by an alien or something? And that's how The Gods Themselves comes off. It's almost a love story, but it is between, I'll describe it as two consciousness. Would you call that Kasenti? Kassanchi? I don't know. But it's between two entities, how about that? That are so inhuman. And somehow Asimov pulls it off to where when you read, everything that's going on for them, like, you really think this is not human. Like, there is nothing about this, like, you can barely even relate to it. And I think that's why it's not so popular a book, but I think that's why it should be, because and I don't know that, I never had the pleasure of meeting Asimov, and I couldn't begin to consume enough interviews or, anything else by him because he was so prolific. In fact, I love the question that was asked of him. If you found out you only had, 5 years to live or something, what would you do? And he said, I would write faster. And that's the thing. The guy was just so goddamn prolific. Even his last book, it was nonfiction, actually. Our Angry Earth, I mentioned it earlier, that he did with Frederick Pohl. It's an ecology work, but I think it's an important one. It's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, the guy just didn't stop thinking, like always coming up with new shit, always. And he was so goddamn good. He is, I've kind of a pantheon of heroes or role models or whatever. I mean, he is fucking up there. He is right up there. Just brilliant. So anyway, the gods themselves, that is how, if you want to read it, that is how you get into it, is that you are going to experience a work of fiction that is not human. I don't know how else to describe it. It is fantastic, and there's a bit of a love story in it, and I'll kind of leave it at that. Just a wonderful, wonderful read. And we're over an hour now, and I want to get to the rest of this stuff. So let's pick up the pace. But it is a standalone novel. The gods themselves does not exist within the greater Asimov universe. So it's also a great way to get introduced to Asimov before you take the deep dive into where everything's connected, man. So the next one, and this is an absolute classic. And this is by somebody that I mentioned. He's best known for his novel Slan, which is kind of like the original novel about mutants, way before there was anything like an X-Men. But I love his book, Voyage of the Space Beagle. Now, this came out in 1950. Voyage of the Space Beagle is actually 4 stories that were printed. I forget exactly where they were printed. Maybe like in, I don't know, Galaxy Magazine or Astounding or something like that back in the day. But it was originally 4 stories that he kind of massaged to turn them into one novel, and that being The Voyage of the Space Beagle. Now, much like, the way I could equate The Voyage of the Space Beagle to you is just like how Forbidden Planet, the movie Forbidden Planet, how pretty much every science fiction movie has in some form or other really just copied Forbidden Planet, which is why I consider it in some ways the greatest science fiction movie of all time. I mean, even Star Trek Star Trek ripped off tons from Forbidden Planet. Like, everybody copies Forbidden Planet. Just like that, I sort of feel like Voyage of the Space Beagle was the progenitor to much of the science fiction that has existed for the past 50 years, in novelized form. And it has to do with this character who, Dr. Elliot Grosvenor, he's what's called a nexialist. And nexialist, and I love that term. I want to be a nexialist in many ways, even though there's some funny things to do with sex about them that I wouldn't be able to agree with. But anyway, a nexialist is effectively a Renaissance man, but like a Renaissance man on metaphorical steroids. Okay, to where like they really are all about learning everything. And the Voyage of the Space Beagle, I mean, they're going from like mission to mission. I mean, it almost plays out like an episode of Star Trek in some form or fashion. But Dr. Grosvenor, kind of has to figure out how to solve all these different things. And he uses his concept of nexialism, which is just like this real kind of generalist approach to science. To figure these things out. So it's a great logical play. And I mean, but at the same time is very much a space opera as well. So it's a lot of fun. It is the start in many ways, I think, it's not space opera started off with Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, the Barsoom novels, which I'm a huge fan of. I love all of Edgar Rice Burroughs' works. I'm a gigantic Tarzan fan. I think all of that's great. And boy, I didn't even mention Philip Jose Farmer. See, there's so many people to talk about. But anyway, A.E. Van Vogt, I think, really, really like made it something where it was serious. Where space opera could be taken very seriously. And I think Voyage of the Space Beagle does that. Just a tremendous book. And I mean, there's a lot of tropes that are there now, it's not something like you think of a novel that really there's no trope, there's nothing else like it, and it sort of stood on its own. You think of like Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man, right? Where it's about this telepathic society. How do you get away with murder in a telepathic society? It's a brilliant book, okay? And no one else has really even touched on it. Minority Report kind of copied it, right? But there's really nothing else like The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, okay? Which also could have easily made this top 8 books, science fiction books. But with the Voyage of the Space Beagle, I think it's great to see the origin of that genre. and how all this stuff works, and how you can, like the nexialism, the way that Dr. Grossvander kind of talks about a lot of this stuff. I think there's a lot of things you could, bring in for some personal application if you wanted to. That's another, kind of interesting thing for the time of science fiction is you had in the 30s and all that, and a lot of these great authors that you think of, Asimov and one of my favorite, how did I not put him on this list? One of my favorite science fiction authors ever, James motherfucking Blish. And I always call him that. I never had the pleasure of meeting the man. James motherfucking Blish is so brilliant. I mean, hot fucking damn is he good. And his Star Trek, speaking of which, his Star Trek novels, I mean, a lot of them, I think he might have taken a lot of inspiration from Voyage of the Space Beagle now that I think about it. But anyway, you had this group of a lot of these different guys. They called themselves the Futurians, and they came out of this New York science fiction club that existed, right? Now, a lot of them, swung more on the communist side. Not all of them, because some of the guys, like the guy that wrote The Syndic, shit. That's terrible. I can't think of his name. Kornbluth. C.M. Kornbluth. Jeez. I was about to smack my own ass if I couldn't figure. No, I don't agree with doing that. I was going to be very mad with myself if I couldn't think of who wrote The Syndic. Anyway, but a lot of these guys, they came out of this group called the Futurians. Okay, and they had all these, really wild, far-out ideas, and they started a lot of what we consider great entertainment today. And so, in sharing that, I think Voyage of the Space Beagle and things like this were really outcroppings of a lot of those different kinds of groups, even though they might be some years removed. Just phenomenal. So definitely check out that. Read anything by A.E. Van Vogt. He is so good. But, read Slan, but I start off with Voyage of the Space Beagle. I think it's a fun book. All right, now we're really down to the final two, okay? And then maybe I'll make some honorable mentions, but we're down to the final two. Now, my number two, I might even put it at number two, but it's totally personal taste. It really does not belong in the pantheon of, say, Voyage of the Space Beagle, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Gods Themselves, or even Battlefield Earth or The Dispossessed or anything like that. It doesn't belong anywhere near any of those. But I love it. It was a book, maybe it's a product of the time of why I loved it so much. But the book and this might shock you, the book was written by William Shatner, Captain Kirk himself. Now, of course, that gives me an automatic bias, especially when I was a teenager when this came out. Because this came out in the mid-90s, this book series. And it's not Tech War, though I love the Tech War books. And it's also not Man of War, which was William Shatner's Mars series, both of which have nothing to do with Star Trek. Though I'll tell you, the Shatnerverse, as it's called, which is all his Star Trek books, they are, without question, in my mind, the best Star Trek books you can read. Next to James motherfucking Blish's books, from way back. But yeah, the Shatnerverse is fucking amazing. Anyway, and Tech War are all great. Every single one of them. Even the later ones. Tech Kill, Tech Money, those were awesome. The Man of War books, I think there was only two of them. Those were great too, his Mars series. But the one that really hit me, and I guess they're technically young, they might be considered young adult because the characters within it are teenagers or end up early 20s because it is a book series. But they're full-on novels. They're not, if I thought that it was meant to appeal to teens, I actually wouldn't have read it. I hate that. I hate that there's so many books that are geared towards young people. You know what? In third grade, you know what I was reading? I read Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn, that first new Star Wars novel. And I wanted to read it. And actually, I credit that with my ability, if I had any advancement in reading comprehension, it's because, I want some new fucking Star Wars, and I don't care what words I have to learn to understand what the hell's going on in this book. I'm going to figure it out. I don't care if I'm in third grade. Woo! Right? So I think I've talked about this in Sovereign Tech. There's a little bit of a problem where when we gear things towards, kind of eternal youth, that people never really mature. I'm not saying grow old. I'm just saying, they might not reach full potential, perhaps, of the human condition. They stay in high school. Anyway, this book had to do with a character named Jim Endicott, who ends up being this very special young boy. and it's kind of an interplanetary series of novels. There's 4 in the series. There's the first one, which is Delta Search, which is the book that I'm putting at number 2 here. Delta Search is the best of the bunch, definitely. And then after that, there's In Alien Hands. Then there's Beyond the Stars, and then there's Shadow Planet. Now, something weird happens in this book series that I don't really like, but whatever, I get it. And Shatner actually does it again in the Shatnerverse, in the much later books of the Shatnerverse, when you get into Starfleet Academy. But what happens in these books is there is a universe reset at the end of Beyond the Stars. Not to say that there isn't a climax in Beyond the Stars, but there's a universe reset. And so when you read Shadow Planet, like, it's still the same characters, but they're very different. Like Jim Endicott's very different and all this. So that's just fair warning if you decide to, try to get your hands on these books and you do read them. And I do recommend reading them. These are space opera, definitely, but lots of fun. Lots and lots of fun. And it gets into some really wild ideas, even for the 90s, and virtual reality, was kind of having a little bit of a kick in the 90s. Not like today where there's an actual infrastructure and we can actually have a VR evolution. But at the time, it explored the idea of people existing entirely in VR. But that was just one aspect of life. There was plenty of, that happened outside of it. And the thing that stuck out for me in this book, now when I read it, I was a teenager. I was, 14, 15, 16, something like this. And, I saw his name, William Shatner. I bought it. There was just no question. It's like, Mommy, can I get that? Yep. Okay. There we go. And what really stuck out for me in this is that the character of Jim Endicott in this is 15, and he meets this gal, in the way that William Shatner describes the gal, who she might be, I think she may be a year older perhaps than Jim Endicott in the book, if I remember correctly. But definitely did a great job of describing her in a very sexy fashion. Again, I'm a teenager at the time. Please respect that. And they get it on. They become lovers at this very young age. And that appealed to me. It's a long story, but I'm just going to say at the time when I was that age and I read that book, because I read that book, I was, shy of Jim Endicott's age. It hit me. I was you got to be careful when you talk about that sort of thing. I understand that. But I'm saying at the time, it was what I read, and it was kind of what I needed. And it was a very emboldening book because it was about, because Jim Endicott is a teenager, but he goes off, not just around the world. He goes off, into the far reaches of space, effectively. And it's some might say it's kind of a cheesy version of Ender's Game. Absolutely not. These books are not. And Orson Scott Card, anything he's done, could have made this list too. Full respect to Ender's Game, and all of that. But no, it's so much more than that. I think a lot of people want to write it off as that, but I don't think so. But Jim Endicott, just especially if you're a teenager, and I think you can still enjoy it now, you can really relate to the character. And you can really relate to what's going on. And I just remember that book being so, and I've read it over and over again, even as I got older. I just remember it giving me a lot of courage, and it felt like it was giving me a lot of permission to go see the world, which I ended up doing. As soon as I could legally get on airplanes, I started flying. I started buying tickets and yeah, take me here. I can go on my own, baby. Woo! And it definitely emboldens you in that way. And it's a great story. Otherwise, it explores a lot of interesting themes, and there's great action in it. So it has everything I think science fiction, something that could be popular in science fiction that it needs to have. It has. So I love that whole series. I was disappointed that they did kind of a mid reboot in the series, but which I can kind of understand why. But yeah, the first one particularly, Delta Search, I think is just wonderful. Now, like I said, William Shatner, of course, now he has a new book series out called Zero G that I started reading, and that's really good. Unfortunately, it's a little government, or it's NASA related, but whatever. That's a really, I'm already enjoying the first book in that series. But he did the Shatnerverse, where there's 3 separate trilogies that exist within the Shatnerverse. And then he did a reboot as well, where he started doing a Starfleet Academy series that followed Captain Kirk. And that was like a complete reboot of the Star Trek universe, which I thought was an interesting idea. It didn't sell well, so it didn't really go anywhere. So, but he still does stuff. But I mean, obviously he has other people writing for him. He's not really the one, doing all the writing. But obviously I think, or in my opinion, obviously you can see the Shatnerisms, we'll say. And I don't mean in the way he speaks. I mean, like, sort of what he gets excited about and what he talks about that's out there. So just wonderful, wonderful book. Now, enough of that. Let's get to number one. Let's do this. You've been waiting for over an hour. And you can imagine the one book I haven't mentioned, or the one book series perhaps that I haven't mentioned. And you're like, where he's got to bring this up. Well, I'm about to. Dune. Woo! Woo! Dune by Frank Herbert. Holy motherfucking shit. Wow. When I first read... So, first off, in fact, let me have a little sip of seltzer here. Raspberry lime. All right. First off, I saw the movie before I read the book. And I knew I was seeing something so far out, something so strange. It's like, I got to know more. I want to know more. And I saw the movie. I remember seeing it when I was a kid. In fact, I have a picture of me where I'm wearing a Dune t-shirt from when the movie came out. And it's like a red, it has a sandworm on it and it's red and whatever. It's not black, so I didn't keep it. Just kidding. I've been doing this that long. But when I first saw the movie, it was the 4-hour version that the Sci-Fi channel was airing, which they call the Alan Smithy version because it wasn't approved by David Lynch. So, they put on the generic name Alan Smithy as a director. That's an old tradition in Hollywood. So I saw that and I was like, this is great. Like, this is really fucking great. I like this. And it didn't hurt that Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard was in it too. And so then I went and I was like, okay, but what's the theatrical version look like? So I went to Saturday Matinee, which was a movie, a videotape store. And I got the theatrical version. I actually like the theatrical version the best because it's kind of the fast food version of it. Or what I actually like, I like the Spice Driver version that you can get your hands on online where it combines everything, even deleted scenes. That's the best version. But I really enjoy, and I've watched more times than I could ever count, the David Lynch version of Dune. And I was like, all right, this is awesome. I got to read the book. And so I read Dune, and I'm just, I'm just going through it like, it's such an amazing achievement of human imagination. Even as a teenager, I was like, how could anybody do this? How could somebody come up with something this amazing? Like, this is so fully realized. Even more, in my opinion, even more so than Lord of the Rings. I think it's considered science fiction's Lord of the Rings. I think it tops it. Easy. My opinion. Value subjective, but I think it does. And yeah, that book is just so good. And there's so many great thoughts in it and like quotes and, just kind of the exploration of everything going on in it is just so wild. It is just so cool. It really has that cool factor going on for it, and it's ironic because I consider it the greatest book ever written, in many ways, but at the same time, like, it has the worst ending. Like the ending is just, Irulan and, and Paul's mother, Jessica saying, history will remember us as wives. That's the last line of the book. What the hell? The movie sure as hell didn't end that way, or at least the David Lynch movie. And it's fine. I get it. But yeah, it's such a fully realized universe. There's so many wild things going on. And I think what makes it so great is you just keep wanting to know more. Like, as soon as the book's over, there's appendix A, B, and C where like they cover all the Fremen words and all this shit, right? You tore through those appendix because you're just like, appendices, you're like, you gotta know. Like, tell me more about this universe because this was so wild. I don't even fully grasp everything that happened, but I gotta know more. That's a great book. That's really why, in my opinion, that's why the Bible has lasted so long, because some of the things are ambiguous and there's some parts where just things seem left out. Like, wait a minute, why'd you skip over that? What's going on there? You think of in the Bible, Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, right? Where it talks about the Nephilim. Like, wait, what? There's giants and they had kids and wait, what the fuck is that? The sons of God slept with the daughters of men. What's all this about? Dune kind of does that. And so I think that's part of the reason why it stands so tall and why it lasts so long, because of this huge exploration. I mean, there's so many things covered, religion, the nature of love, ecology, like all these different ideas. I mean, there's just, there's so much there, and it's so in depth. It's so good. Now, ironically, so you create this character of Muad'Dib, which, again, it kind of falls in line, because Muad'Dib is a teenager, in the first book. It kind of falls in line with that, where, like, you're like, wow, this is really great. You could, not that I ever, like, had delusions of God or, becoming a god or anything, but, like, it appeals to you, right, when you're younger, sure. And it appeals now because, it's obviously an adult work in every way. And certainly the sequel books are as well. But when you get into, so the sequel book, Dune Messiah, that book, I started, after I read Dune, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to buy the whole fucking series. And I did, without reading them. I read the whole damn thing, I bought them all at once. And I started reading Dune Messiah, and the whole book is about, okay, how do we kill Muad'Dib? And I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? You just created one of the greatest literary characters of all time, and now you just want to off him? It was about a year before I finished the rest of the Dune novels, because I threw down Dune Messiah and I just started stomping on it. I was so mad that they wanted to kill Muad'Dib, this character that I thought was so cool, and so amazing. But then eventually I did end up finishing. I got to Chapter House Dune and all that. I went through the whole series, and just an amazing piece of work. All of it is just brilliant. Now, this gets into, I could spend a whole episode talking about the Dune series in general, because now we get into the subject of, now, there's still Dune books coming out to this day. In fact, just last month, Navigators of Dune came out. I mean, it's not a 6-book series anymore. Now, it's a fucking, like a 20-book series. It's huge. And Kevin J. Anderson and Brian Herbert being Frank Herbert's son, of course, Frank Herbert, the writer of Dune, has been just keep putting these out. They started off with House Atreides, which I thought was actually pretty good. And then they did that series. They did House Harkonnen, House Carino, and then they did the Balerian Jihad. And they kept going on with that. They did the Battle of Corrin and all this. And somewhere along the way, I think, and I'm not the only one, there's a lot of Dune fans who are like, this is obviously not what Frank Herbert had in mind. This is not, because they were claiming, Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson were claiming that they were basing this off of notes that Frank Herbert wrote that they found in some bank deposit box. No, as far as I know, nobody's ever seen those fucking notes, other than Brian Herbert and maybe his mom and Kevin J. Anderson. So it's kind of hearsay, right? And there's things, because there's a book that was released in the 80s, or I think it was in the 80s, called the Dune Encyclopedia, which was made, as I understand it, while Frank Herbert was alive. And here's the thing, is that there are things in the Dune Encyclopedia which Frank Herbert would have paid attention to, right? He would have been a part of, right? So if there was something in there that he didn't like, he could have said, don't do it. There are things in the Dune Encyclopedia that directly contradict events that have happened in the greater Dune novels, or quote unquote greater as in larger as in more, not as in that they're great. In the Dune novels by by Kevin J. Anderson and Brian Herbert. So a lot of people think that Brian Herbert's making this up as he goes along. And I'm kind of inclined to believe that, to agree with that. Maybe there's some elements, maybe there's something that is based off of some kind of notes from Frank Herbert. Maybe somewhere in there. I don't know. But they do play off as very strange, and they're not the greatest of books either. In fact, they finally came out with Dune 7, which they split into 2 books, of course. And it was good, but it was kind of and that's the one where we did know. We knew that he was working on we knew that Frank Herbert was working on a Dune 7. But it wasn't, I don't know, everything just kind of went Talaxu and so I don't know. I recommend reading the Dune books without reservation, even after, when you get past Dune Messiah, you find out what's going on with Children of Dune and all that. But I don't know that I recommend reading everything of Dune, like reading all of the. I mean, I think they're good, they're enjoyable. I like reading them, but I don't blame you for not wanting to get into those. And speaking of some of like the Dune movies and all this, I mean, the Dune, this is the thing, just to prove the point of just how much there was with Dune, and it's so much open to interpretation. I think a lot of these books outcrop from that interpretation. You've had some of the best video games ever made. Just straight up, some of the best video games ever made were based on Dune. Dune 2 is really the first RTS in a very real sense. It's the very first real-time strategy game, which are my favorite games. Dune 2 was quintessential to that. That was part of the reason I was excited to watch the movie. Was like, oh yeah, like Dune 2, the game, that was fucking great. Dune 2000, Emperor of Dune, all these games are really good. And then there's there's just so much that has been inspired by Dune. And boy, I'm trying to think where I was going to go with that, but I think that pretty much covers it. Just that there's a lot of Dune out there. It's all super enjoyable. But the original is still the original and could stand on its own for all time. But there's, an entire series that I think does a great job of following up on it. So Dune, I put way at the top. It is number one as far as the greatest science fiction books. That's not a controversial thing for me to say, but there you go. If you want me to do a list of controversial science fiction books or rarely heard of science fiction books, perhaps, that are like a top 8 list of that, you can ask me and I'll do it. I could certainly do that list. But this was just in general, like what I think are just the greatest shit out there. And I threw in a couple of, couple curveballs, certainly. But like with Quest for Tomorrow series from William Shatner. But anyway, I want to make I'm just going to make some quick honorable mentions here. If you're looking for more, say, anarchist, or liberty-oriented, like science fiction, there's actually some great books out there. There is the Great Explosion, and this is from the 50s, and it was originally a short story, but then it was such a popular short story, he turned it into a full-on novel by Eric Frank Russell. And you're not going to get this digitally. You'll get the short story. You can find that's published everywhere. But fantastic book. And it's all about kind of like The Dispossessed, to where there is this, like you get to contrast different social structures. And in the Great Explosion, one of the, what happens is this guy discovers really inexpensive warp drive, faster than light drive, because he's trying to make a penny float in midair. And he ends up discovering faster than light travel. And so this creates this, that's the Great Explosion. Like, people go and they find their own planet and they live their lives. There's religious planets. There's all these different kinds of things. One of them is a very kind of almost a pacifistic anarchist planet. And things get really interesting there. So I think The Great Explosion by Eric Frank Russell is a great liberty-oriented piece of fiction. Then you have Victor Coleman's Kings of the High Frontier. Now, I've mentioned this recently. I don't know if it was in a Q&A or in a Sovereign Tech Prime episode, but it actually just a great. It's all about just like kind of this real free market attempt to get into space. Very, very worthy read. I'm just going to mention it. You're going to have to. I think it's only available in hardcover, and it was a limited print run, even though Gregory Benford actually did the afterword for it. He seemed to really enjoy it, who's a popular science fiction author. But I think I paid something like $30-$40 for a copy. So, you might have to shell out for that one. But in my opinion, I think it's absolutely worth it. Here's another one that I really enjoyed, and I'm not going to give too much away on it, but it's actually... boy, if I could pronounce her name, F. Gwynplaine McIntyre, okay, and it's The Woman Between the Worlds. This is another one. This kind of fits in, especially if you like. Oh man, it's a lot of fun because it takes place in sort of the Victorian era. So in some ways, it kind of fits in with the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's not steampunk really, though I do enjoy steampunk novels. Just look it up. Woman Between the Worlds by F. Gwynplaine McIntyre. just a great freaking read, and from the 90s even, which is really good. I like a lot of books like that. Like what was it, the one by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, The Difference Engine, or it's a Victorian book, but like it throws in some science fiction on that. I always enjoy that, and it's where it's not exactly like steampunk to the point of steampunk being a cliche, but to where like it sort of fits. I always enjoy that sort of thing. Another one that I mentioned, who I'll mention all the time because he's a personal hero and a one-time friend. I haven't kept up, and the guy doesn't use computers. But Harlan Ellison's The Essential Ellison. Now, you want to get the revised and expanded version. Good luck getting that. There's times where you can get it for $5. There's times where you have to pay $300 for it. Okay, it's a very rare book. I actually did it for a pick of the week when we used to do what was called pick of the week at the end of the episode, which is now the climax. But anyway, you get The Essential Ellison, and it's a really great, the 50-year retrospective. It's just wonderful, and you will get just some of the best short stories, science fiction short stories, or as he would like, speculative fiction short stories that you can imagine. I mean, just the best ever done. He's one of the most translated authors in the world. In fact, he might, I think, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, or Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man. One of those, I think, is actually the most published short story in the world. So that says something. The other one I'm going to mention real quick is Tomorrow's Eve by, and this is another one I'm going to have a very hard time pronouncing. It's a French book. This one's translated by Robert Martin Adams. I think it's the best translation you can find. But by Villiers de Ile Adam. I probably said that wrong. But Tomorrow's Eve. And this is where the character in Sovryn Tech of Hadley, where she comes from. Now, this is, just like Jules Verne, this is a 19th century work, but it has to do with an android woman. And what a commentary on how, especially if you're a fan of what Westworld's going into right now, read Tomorrow's Eve. Tomorrow's Eve was making these claims, was going down the story of how do you treat an android, blah, 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 all this 200 years ago. It's fantastic. It is a great, great read, and I do recommend the translation by Robert Martin Adams. I think he does the best job. But Tomorrow's Eve, you definitely want to check that out. Anyway, that's it. I won't lay any more on you. I could go on. I could talk about the Gore novels, by John Norman, or the Telnarian histories that he did, or even his independent works. The 2001 books by Arthur C. Clarke. I love those. 2061 is my favorite. There's so many great series out there, but this is an introduction where you could get started, perhaps. If you want to get reading things. And Battlefield Earth, I started off with that. That is a great one to start off with. Dune might be a big pill to swallow, and Battlefield Earth is a big pill to swallow, but it could get you used to reading a really long book, but one that is never, ever boring. It is just nonstop action somehow. I don't know how he pulled it off, but he did it. So anyway, there you have it. Of course, all kinds of episodes will be coming out in the next few days. So Carpe Lucem, everybody. Woo! I'll see you on the other side. Oh man, I can't wait to show you 199C. Oh yes.
You just experienced Sovryn Tech. Go to sovryntech.com, that's SOVRYN tech.com, and connect with us there. Find links from today's show and catch our podcast feed. Sovryn Tech is copy heart. Copying art is an act of love, and love is not subject to law. So please share the show however you like. Welcome to the evolution.